Hank is one of the worst, if not the worst brawler in the game, and he has been for pretty much his entire lifespan. In this video, we will be looking at his history and why he ended up in his current situation. Hank was added to the game on June 7th, 2023, during Season 18. He came with that new quirky kind of main attack, which wasn't based on shooting projectiles and with that draining your ammo bar, but rather using your ammo bar to build up a big bubble and releasing it all at once. His super wasn't that revolutionary, being 6 projectiles flying in all directions and dealing 2000 damage per hit at level 11. This Hank was very different and probably a bit stronger than his current version, but what made him completely OP was the bug with his damage output, especially regarding his main attack. On paper, it was actually weaker than the current version, dealing 500 damage at 0 charge in comparison to today's 525. The mentioned bug, for some reason, completely messed up Hank's damage scaling when using, for example, power cubes or things like an 8-bit or Colonel Ruff super. Let me explain. Normally, brawlers get a 20% damage increase when they pick up Colonel Ruff's power up, a 35% increase when in reach of 8-bit's turret, which goes up to 50 with his first star power, and 15% when they have damage gear active. Though Hank for some reason got 44%, 82.25%, 125% and 32.25% respectively, meaning he got more than double of what he should have gotten in these scenarios. Hank's normal damage with a maximum bubble at the time was 3000 at level 11, which meant that max Hank would deal 4320 damage with Colonel Ruff's power up, 5367 damage in range of 8-bit's turret, or 6750 with 8-bit's first star power, and with damage gear active he would deal 3967 damage. That meant that if you combined 8-bit with first star power, Colonel Ruff's and Hank with damage gear, he could consistently deal 9037 damage. Normally, that should have been 5550. That means that instead of one-hitting all of these brawlers with these power-ups, it were these. And given it was pretty easy to keep all of these boosts active during the game, that was incredibly OP. However, where this got even worse was in Showdown with power cubes. Normally, every power cube you collect adds 10 additional percentages of your damage without power cubes to your damage output. For Hank, it was the same formula, with just a teeny tiny detail. It was cubed. That meant that on the first cube, instead of getting your old damage times 1.1, you would get it times 1.21, so basically twice as much boost. On the second, you would get plus 44% instead of plus 20%. On your third, it would be plus 69% instead of plus 30. And with 4 cubes, it would be plus 96% instead of plus 40%. This is the normal graph of damage increase with cubes for Hank. And this is it with the glitch. Here you can see that already at 10 cubes, Hank dealt double the damage he was supposed to deal, being 12,000 instead of 6,000. Yeah, he was stupidly OP. This obviously caused a big outrage in the community, and therefore it got patched only 5 days later, on June 12th, 2023. With that, besides some further smaller bug fixes, they also made it so that Hank's super charge rate differs depending on how big the damage he deals is. Oh yeah, and they also nerfed his damage by 11 and his health by 17%. Now, those were very significant nerfs, but Hank was still a pretty strong brawler and also one that was very frustrating to play against. So, in the next balance changes on June 27, 2023, Hank received 4 more nerfs. Firstly, they made it so that he couldn't heal up anymore whilst he was charging his main attack, which was one of the frustrating things he had before, because he could basically always have a bubble active. This change in particular was probably what led to his downfall. The second thing that was also removing frustration was that Hank would no longer be invisible when standing, for example, in a bush or a sandy super, when charging his main attack. That meant that he couldn't just catch you off guard out of a bush, which given his pretty decent range was very nice to get rid of. Also, Hank's super charge rate was lowered from 33 to 20% with fully charged hits, meaning instead of 3, he would need 5 hits to charge his super. And lastly, his first star power, which gives him increased movement speed when carrying a max bubble, was nerfed from 20 to 10%. These changes didn't balance Hank though, they absolutely killed him. On July 24th, so basically a month after his nerf, his use rate over 500 trophies was at around 0.2%, an incredibly low number. At that point, there were 68 brawlers in the game, meaning that the average use rate was 100% divided by 68, which would be 1.47%. That is over 7 times of what Hank had. By the way, I had to only use the data from above 500 trophies, as below that most brawlers have pretty similar use rates just because people want to get everybody to a certain rank. And sometimes the worst brawlers actually have higher use rates, especially on release, because it takes people longer to do that. Above 500 though, most people just won't play the brawlers if they suck. Therefore, only use rates above 500 trophies are actually a somewhat accurate representation of the power of a brawler. Now, having a brawler this week obviously ain't something Supercell wants, but at least he wasn't terrorizing the game anymore. 1 month later, on 15th of August, Supercell finally decided to give Hank a very much needed buff. His health was increased by 8% from 5k to 5.4k, and the damage of his super was increased from 1000 to 1320 per torpedo. These buffs proved to be very ineffective though, as his use rate stayed basically where it was before the buff. So, another month later, on September 5th, Hank received another major buff. His health was increased by another 400 to now 5800, and his main attack damage got increased by 17% from 450 to 525 at minimal charge. All of these numbers were at level 1 by the way. Lastly, they increased his super charge rate from 20 to now 25% with a full charge, meaning he would now only need 4 instead of 5 maximum charge hits to charge his super. This did help him a bit, lifting his use rate in September to 0.44%, still far below average, but at least double of what he had before. However, over the following weeks, his use rate would constantly decline until, in October 2023, it was back to 0.2 without any other buffs or nerfs happening. This would go as low as 0.16% in December of 2023. I think at this point it got pretty clear that fixing this brawler would take something more complex than a simple stat buff. And there was one main reason for that: his core mechanic, the bubble. The problem is that if he can continuously charge a full bubble and potentially hit several opponents with it, for example due to a good matchup and map, he could potentially be very overpowered and frustrating to play against, in particular when played by a skilled player. However, if he gets constantly interrupted, for example by having to heal or simply by dying, and is unable to abuse his splash damage, his damage output can be very underwhelming. This is especially the case in Solo Showdown, which, unfortunately for Hank, is by far the most played mode in the game. Therefore, you need to somehow make him more versatile for all kind of maps, modes and matchups, of course without removing the core principle of his main attack. Doing all of that is very challenging and time consuming for developers, so it's understandable that Supercell rather kept him in a rather weak spot. They didn't really know what to do with Hank, which is shown quite well by the fact that regardless of him always having a pretty bad use rate, around 0.22 above 500 trophies, it would take another 11 months, till 23rd of April 2024, for Hank to get his next balance changes. However, this time, probably due to the reasons from earlier, they wouldn't just give him another stat buff. Instead, he would get a rework. His super would now heal 50% of his missing health, but his health was decreased from 5800 to 5400. Now, I do think that made him a better and, more importantly, a more versatile brawler with a lot more viability, but his use rate would not profit from this at all. Actually, a month later, it was at 0.17. The reason why I'm using use rates from 1 month later is that only 4 days after those balance changes, on April 29th, 2024, something else happened. Mutations were added to the game. In case you didn't play back then, Mutations were a free week event where you could open eggs to unlock special abilities for certain brawlers, called Mutations, which you could then use in 2 modes which would switch every day. Now, some mutations were certainly stronger than others. Hank's was that every time he got hit, he would automatically use a level 1 super, which if you stand directly in something, deals 7,920 damage. This was OP everywhere, but it did stand out in one mode in particular, Heist. Given that the Heist save has 27,000 health, it would take 10 Hank supers, aka 10 hits, on a Hank standing on the Heist save to end the game. This led to his overall use rate climbing to 0.94% and higher. However, up to 12.49% on the Heist maps when they had mutations. This is ridiculously high. On May 20th, 2024, mutations were removed, and with that, Hank was back in the trash. Hank would also receive a slight health buff from 5,400 to 5,600 at the end of June, but you might be able to guess how much that helped. It really seemed like Hank was gonna have a 0.2 use rate forever, but on December 10th, 2024, Hank received a trait which slowly charges his super when he takes damage, similar to a lot of other tanks. At first glance, this doesn't seem that significant, but for Hank, who really struggled to get a super in most scenarios, this really helped to be able to get it more often, which enables him to play more aggressively and take bigger risks. Over the following months, Hank's use rate would constantly increase, all the way up to 1.1% above 500 trophies. All in all, this buff did make Hank a way better brawler. But for a brawler like Hank, this just meant that he went from absolutely terrible to just decently below average. Still not necessarily the place you want to be as a brawler. Okay, so how do we get players to use and invest into Hank if most of them have probably forgotten he exists? You thinking what I'm thinking? Hank's Hypercharge was added to the game on the 25th of February 2025. Besides the usual stat buffs, it gives all of Hank's torpedoes from his super the ability to home in on enemies. His Hypercharge takes 2.4 supers to charge up, which really isn't that much for Hank, especially due to the tank trait he received just a few months earlier. Unfortunately, Hank's use rates right afterwards don't give us a good picture of just how broken he was, as in casual play basically nobody had Hank leveled up properly, as for the past year he had seen pretty much no viability, and in higher ranked, where people may have him leveled up, he would just get blocked because of how OP he was. To truly understand the power the Hypercharge added to Hank, we need to take a look at the competitive tier lists. And by doing so, we can see that Hank was an absolute top tier. The added Hypercharge actually wasn't the only reason for that though. In the same update that added Hank's Hypercharge, all gadgets were reworked. Unlike prior, where you had 3 gadgets with a small 5-second cooldown in between, you now had infinite, but with bigger cooldowns, ranging from 8 seconds for very weak gadgets, all the way up to 22 seconds for very strong gadgets. This generally buffed Hank's second gadget quite a bit, by giving him his 40% shield super often. It's kind of funny to see how Hank was released absolutely broken, then forgotten in the trash for a year and a half, and then with just one patch catapulted straight up into S tier again. It's definitely going to be interesting to see how Hank does in the future. Alright, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or suggestions, please let me know in the comments. I put a lot of time and effort into this video, so I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like. Thanks, until next time, bye.